When you started recording. Amazing. Okay, great. So I have the absolute pleasure of introducing Dr. Sally King, who obviously most of you will be familiar with. So I'm only going to give the briefest of introductions so she can get on with talking about her brand new book. So Sally is currently a visiting fellow in the Department of Women and Children's Health School of Life Core Sciences at King's College London. She also completed her PhD at King's College London, and she is the founder of the website Menstrual Matters, which is a website I always refer people to anytime they have kind of any questions about menstrual health. It's an absolutely fantastic resource. So if you don't know it, please go check it out. Okay, so I will hand over now to you, Sally, to talk about your book, Menstrual Myth Busting: The Case of the Hormonal Female.
Thank you, Maria. Thanks everybody for coming. It's really nice to see a lot of friends and family here, as well as menstrual activists and researchers and from people from all over the world. It's really brilliant. The main thing is that I'm so relieved that this book is finally out. It's just taken a long time. Anyway, I'm going to start the presentation with just maybe about a half an hour description of some of the stuff that's in the book. And then it'll be questions by chat, I think would be best. So while you're listening, if any questions come up, just put them in the chat and Maria and Mark will have a quick look. And then we'll have a bit more of a sort of question and answer session towards the end of this book launch. But thanks very much and hello to everybody. Okay, right, here we go. So this is what we're going to talk about today in the book launch. What might you not know already about your menstruating body or about the human menstrual physiology? What might you know? And I've put that in little scare quotes because maybe some of the things you think you know are perhaps incorrect. Why is this the case? And what are the impacts of our current state of menstrual education? And then I go a bit more into the book. So the book is really based on my PhD research, which was applying the first bit to the example of PMS. So if we're not menstrually literate, then what are the implications of this, particularly regarding our health? And this is even for medical and sort of biological work on the menstrual cycle. Okay. So when I give presentations, this could be to medics or to members of the public or to menstrual health activists, I often start with this question. So given that 98% of mammals, so pretty much all mammals, don't menstruate, why is it that 1.6% of mammals do? So in the case of humans, why is it that you think that we menstruate? Now, normally this is an interactive part of the presentation, which we don't have time for today. So we'll just click on to the answer slide. This is usually a big shock to people, including GPs, including gynecologists even, because this is something that we don't really learn about, particularly at school or even med school. So the most common answers I hear from people are actually A and C. People think that we have periods maybe to clean out the womb. Maybe there's something that needs clearing out, either something toxic or unhealthy or something problematic. Or the general sort of consensus is that we have periods to help prepare the womb for pregnancy. But this isn't actually the case. So, as I said before, very few mammals actually menstruate. This isn't a mammal thing. This is quite a rare experience for mammals. It's happened in evolutionary trees of at least 4 separate species, very different species. So it's us and our primate cousins, so chimps and orangutans, bonobos. It's the elephant shrew, which is a small shrew-like creature, but is actually, from its name, sort of genetically connected to elephants rather than mice. There's the latest member of the menstruating gang, and that's the spiny mouse in the picture. There are some old-world monkeys, and there is a couple of bat species that menstruate, and that's it. Now, there's a very unique feature that we all share. So we're very different types and sizes of mammals that have this menstrual adaptation. And the fact that something has evolved in separate species in different timescales usually means that there's some sort of survival advantage to that adaptation. And the thing that all of us share, as well as menstruation, is a complicated word called spontaneous decidualization. So spontaneous just means automatic, that's all that means. And then decidualization refers to the thickening of the lining of the womb, which in 98% of mammals only happens if there is an embryo ready to latch on to the inside of the womb. And in fact, it starts thickening in response to hormones coming from the placenta, coming out of that embryo as it wants to attach to the inside of the womb. But in menstruating species, this thickening of the womb lining happens automatically. There's the spontaneous bit. And in humans, so we have a cycle to our ovulation. So, for instance, primates are more seasonal as to when they're fertile. But humans, we're fertile throughout the year, and we have our cycles, which is a ovarian cycle, which actually we are generally taught about at school. And in response to the normal sort of hormonal changes happening within our own bodies, this starts a thickening process on a regular basis. And in fact, it happens whether you've ovulated or not. It happens, of course, because we start when we're from 8 years old, but typically around 12 years old, before we've ever had sex, before we're ever ready to have sex. Children, of course, it's not advised to get pregnant. Humans, again, we're not very well built for giving birth at the best of times, but particularly not before we finish growing and our hips are wide enough to actually give birth. So because of all these factors, the most likely reason why we've developed this kind of automatic shedding of the womb lining, or thickening and then shedding of the womb lining, is probably to protect us from the dangers of either unviable or potentially dangerous pregnancies. So the idea is that if there's a pregnancy that's wrong in some way, so either the genetics are wrong, or physically the embryo is wrong, or the placenta is either too far or not far enough in the womb lining, that we have this function, the period, which is the removal of this tissue and anything inside the womb, be there an egg or not, be there an embryo or not, to remove it from the body to protect the parent, the mother, from the sort of resource-intensive process that is pregnancy. You know, it's 9 months of your nutrients being shared with another being, but also there are a lot of dangers, particularly in human pregnancies, lots of health conditions, but also the danger of childbirth itself. So actually the regular loss of blood in our periods, which is painful, it's not very good for us in that, you know, we're losing blood, we're losing iron every few weeks. It's not necessarily good for our health, but in evolutionary terms, it highly increases our chances of survival because there are fewer inviable or potentially dangerous pregnancies occurring. So this is quite oppositional to what we're generally led to believe that the female reproductive body is all about. We hear about the ovulation, we hear about the getting pregnant and wanting to have children. We hear less so about the role of periods and what they do. So we're also not taught sort of all of the surrounding information about why that makes sense for us as humans. So we have quite a low conception rate compared to pretty much all other mammals. It's estimated about 25%, so 1 in 4 chances with 2 fertile heterosexual penetrative sex without any contraception. That's pretty low compared to other species. We have a very large proportion of the gametes, that's the sperms and the eggs, but also embryos that are unviable. Again, in comparison to other mammals, we have much higher rates of that. We have extremely high spontaneous abortion, which is the proper name, the traditional name for miscarriage. So, as most of us know, you're not supposed to tell people if you're pregnant for the first 12 weeks, and that's because of the extremely high rates of miscarriage for us. And it also makes sense because we have, of all the mammals, the way that our placenta is attached to the womb is the most invasive of any species. And this is why we get, well, among other things, things like gestational diabetes, hypertension and things, sort of dangerous health issues sometimes are caused by that placental invasion. You've probably also not been taught much about the menstrual cycle beyond the kind of ovarian cycle, the bit about the hormones going up and down and triggering particularly ovulation, maybe a little bit about how if there is no pregnancy, you might get a period, but you're not taught about this very important, the key third event of the cycle, which is decidualization. And it's, sort of the fact that periods relate to that, they're not sort of something that happen on their own. We're certainly not taught anything about the inflammatory nature of those three events, the sort of physical things happening in your body. At ovulation, an egg has to burst through the wall of the ovary and find its way down the fallopian tube. And then in spontaneous decidualization, you've got all this energy going into creating tissue, new tissue, very quickly and very rapidly, sort of within the womb. And then, of course, menstruation, as most of us know, involving those sort of muscular cramps to try and help get rid of that tissue and all the blood loss and the sort of feelings of fatigue. These are very physical events, but that's not typically what we're taught. We're just taught that kind of very general, abstract diagram, and we're told that that's the menstrual cycle. We're certainly not taught that the female reproductive body and the menstrual cycle is both for conception, the ovarian part, but also contraception. This is what spontaneous decidualization and periods have evolved for, is to be able to get rid of problematic pregnancies, or in the case of most cycles where there is no pregnancy, that tissue has to be removed from the body. So what are we taught? So this diagram here on the right is quite a typical sort of diagram that certainly the last sort of 30 or so years, most people have been taught at secondary school. So you usually are taught two of the three events. You're taught about ovulation, probably mainly, and then you're taught about menstruation, but often it's positioned in relation to conception. So if there is no pregnancy, then you get a period. This isn't not telling you about the purpose of periods, it's kind of obscuring their actual function. And you probably have been taught something about the roles of different hormones, so luteinizing hormone, follicle stimulating hormone, estrogen and progestins. What you're not taught is that the exact same hormones are in the male body, and they also orchestrate the male generation of sperm. Exactly the same hormones, exactly the same sort of journeys to and from the brain to the gonads. In the case of sperm function, testosterone's involved and another hormone called inhibin. But essentially, it's very similar. We're just as hormonal as men, and men who don't have a monthly cycle, they're producing sperm all the time. They're actually, in some ways, more hormonal if you're going to get technical. We're left to sort of imply certain things by what we're taught and also by what we're not taught. So as I've said before, that our bodies are somehow for or pro-conception with no mention of anything else. It's heavily implied that the female body, the reproductive body, is hormonal, and this is presented as if this isn't the case for men. Not true. There's also a lot of implicit assumptions about how the sort of changes we might experience, pain, blood loss, fatigue, digestive issues, constipation, diarrhea, that you very commonly experienced around the period, that those are caused by the sex hormones, the female sex hormones. And it also implies by not learning male reproductive physiology, particularly the hormonal coordination of their reproductive bodies, as this is a big sex difference. So women are hormonal, men are not. So my previous research, actually off the back of my PhD, I did a review of textbooks. So both in the UK, we typically learn about human reproduction at GCSE, so age 15, 16. And then these are all medical textbooks used in general medicine and then even specialized gynecology, specialized reproductive physiology textbooks. So these are the sort of most popular titles in physiology textbooks, not just in the UK, probably globally. These are well-known books. And as you can see, all of them included the hormonal coordination of the reproductive system. And none of them, if you look at the column C, none of them said anything about the abortive fashion purpose of menstruation. Indeed, hardly any of them sort of scarce mention of the inflammatory nature, these physical changes happening in the body. And then again, surprisingly few mentioning anything to do with pain, anything to do with blood loss, nothing to do with temperature increases that we know happen between ovulation and the period, nothing to do with any health issues or physiological changes, particularly over time in relation to iron deficiency. And then I've put that extra one on about male gamete development. I didn't do that in my review, but it would be interesting to see whether they include anything to sort of show how similar these processes actually are in male and female humans. So the point of this slide is you didn't know this information. Why not? You're not taught it. Not just you. If most of you are sort of not medical people, but I'm talking about even gynecologists, they're not taught this. Where this information comes from and where it's well established, and it's not controversial physiology at all, is within infertility literature. So only those going on to specialise in infertility work, or a few people, really a handful of people that go on to work in things like endometriosis or like severe menstrual health issues, only then do you learn about this physiology. So why are we taught some bits and not other bits about our bodies? Well, there isn't a scientific reason for this. In fact, the stuff we're taught about the hormones is actually quite complex science and quite difficult. Whereas talking about what's physically happening in the body, how it's inflammatory, how anti-inflammatory measures can improve people's experiences, talking about what's normal, what's not for people to experience, is actually less difficult to teach, particularly to children. So if it's not scientific reason, it's got to be social political reasons. I think the main one is there is a very strong bias within all societies that the idea that the female body is for having and caring for children, rather than this being an option, the way that the male body, you can become a father or not. For us, it's seen as more of a role, almost a prescribed role, that is the point of having a female body. There's also this idea that we are hormonal. Again, as I mentioned, by not teaching us about the hormonal changes happening in the male body, people genuinely believe there are these huge differences between male and female bodies and psyches and ways of being. And one of them is that women are hormonal. And this has a political meaning as well as a technical or biological one, which is this sort of capricious, emotional, over-emotional, pathologically emotional, sometimes irrational. Maybe you invent things, you exaggerate things. It's basically the myth of the hysterical female, but in its current form, which is very much the hormonal female. So there are implications for this sort of omission in our education. We know, and a recent report came out in December in the UK about medical misogyny. And what that refers to is when female patients in particular, but especially if you're of a racialized ethnicity, so black or brown-skinned British women or people from overseas, not being treated properly, not being examined, not being prescribed medication, not being referred for medical appointments, and generally either being explicitly or implicitly disbelieved, not getting treatment for their conditions. This has severe implications, particularly around maternal mortality. So in the US, I think it's something like you're 20 times more likely to die during childbirth if you're a Black American woman. And in the UK, it's something like 4 or 5 times more likely. So we have the same racial disparities. There's no biological or medical explanation for this disparity. This is unconscious bias. And one of those factors is disbelief in what people are saying when they say they're in pain or they don't think it's right or what they're experiencing needs further attention. As many people in this room will know, reproductive health, women's health in general, anything beyond infertility is extremely low status within science. It's considered mysterious, unknown, unknowable. It's minimized, it's underfunded. Only really when you're pregnant do people start taking interest in women's health. And that's, of course, because suddenly it has an impact on somebody else's life, not just the woman's. So, for instance, the word miscarriage is not only inaccurate, but it's very judgmental. So nearly all miscarriages are due to some issue with the embryo, be it genetic, physical, or placental, or some sort of issue whereby the body decides, you know what, it's safer for you to get rid of this pregnancy. So it's actually the word spontaneous abortion, although it has the word abortion in, which is also highly politicized, that's the technical term, and it reveals a bit more than, for instance, miscarriage, which I think blames the mother, blames the woman. You haven't carried this pregnancy well. Either your body is wrong or you did something you shouldn't have done. And I know that people internalize this and feel a lot of guilt after a miscarriage, which is completely unnecessary. So in most of those cases, miscarriage is really, it's your body protecting you from the dangers of a potentially unviable and potentially dangerous pregnancy. So while a miscarriage is always upsetting, it's always a distressing experience, it doesn't have to be laden with guilt the way that I think current medical and general knowledge of the experience has. So there's, of course, implications for what we're taught and what we're not taught. We get this idea of women being hormonal. If all we're taught about the female reproductive body is its hormonal coordination, of course, we're going to assume that women are hormonal. This is very much tied to the belief, the gender myth of hormonal women being full of rage, being irrational. Basically not the rational man, we are the irrational female. As we mentioned before, there are health inequalities related to this, poor patient outcomes. We don't get enough research, don't get enough funding for women's health issues. Motherhood and parenthood, or the sort of pro-natalist bias, positions becoming a mother or as the norm for women rather than something that's an option. And it's not actually certain that you will get pregnant and successfully deliver a child anyway. Around 10% of the population, both male and female, are infertile. And that's completely normal for all mammals, actually. That's a similar rate across most mammals. We also have, sadly, the pathologization and even criminalization in some countries of very, you could argue, healthy experiences such as infertility and also miscarriage, known as spontaneous abortion. So there's even persecution of natural processes due to this ignorance. Also, this is really bad science. Any bias within science isn't good, but something that has, for the past 100 years, kind of really shaped what we know and what we don't know about women's health is really problematic. As we'll see in a minute with the case of PMS, by thinking of the menstrual cycle just in terms of its hormonal coordination, just that sort of abstract diagram, has severely limited the quality and the progress made in relation to menstrual health research, because even though they find there is no causality between, let's say, estrogen or progesterone and any symptoms, unless you know about that other physiology that's happening, you just think, oh, more research is needed, we need to look into this. Right, the book. So I had to kind of give that introduction because the book builds on this. The first chapter is very much what we've just gone over, sort of how what we know about the menstrual cycle has been so reduced and sort of mystified, sort of made mystical and beyond our knowledge, that I have to kind of always start any talk I give with what's missing from your basic education. So that's chapter 1 of the book. Chapter 2 is how did we get to this state? This is really interesting, particularly if you're an activist or a non-academic and you want to know, well, how did we get to this point where even gynecologists are not being taught established physiological information? And there's been a long history of how we got from sort of medical hysteria, female hysteria, to the idea of hormonal female, and also there's always been some sort of response from women, either academics or activists, saying these kind of medical constructions around menstrual health are problematic. You're sort of implying that all women, for instance, that when you get your periods or when you're pregnant or if you go through menopause, are somehow ill rather than this being a healthy process. And then the second part of the book goes into this study that I did. So I sort of want to go into, so what are the implications in particular for a medical diagnosis? PMS is what most of us refer to with that acronym. And it refers for most people who experience it as anything and everything that we experience on a cyclic basis, either just before or during the period, and sometimes even around ovulation. And we're usually describing a sort of range of painful, physical, digestive, fatigue, those sorts of symptoms. But I had noticed before I did my PhD that in a lot of the academic literature, both the biological, sort of medical literature, but also the feminist critical literature that was sort of critiquing the work of these medical doctors, they were mainly talking about emotional distress, not these physical changes, and certainly not the physiology behind them. So chapter 3 is kind of why I asked this question, which was broadly what counts as a premenstrual symptom. And it goes into a bit about what I did. So I spoke to about half of the world's experts on PMS, which sounds super impressive until you realize that's only about 16 people. Very few people regularly publishing and still publishing on this topic. But I did manage to speak to 6 out of the top 10 people who've ever published on PMS. That's pretty good. And then I spoke to people who self-identified as suffering from PMS. And this was as diverse a group as I could manage in London, and a couple of people from overseas. And I just asked them to describe PMS, asked some sort of set questions, and I compared what they said with the available population data that we have regarding cyclical changes and symptoms. And the idea being that if what people are describing doesn't reflect what we know about physiology or their symptoms, then what are they talking about? Again, it's this idea that if PMS experts are talking about something that isn't based in any evidence, then it's likely that there are social myths unintentionally and unconsciously impacting their work. And the next 4 chapters, so chapters 4 to 7, I basically found 4 major themes in the data. I did a discourse analysis, and I go into each theme in detail with all the supporting data, what people said and what does that mean for each one. And then in the conclusion is a conclusion, so what can we conclude from this study, but also a call to action. And that action is the same for all of my work for the past 10 years, which is we need better menstrual and mental, actually, health literacy. We really need to teach kids about this. So this is no longer a mysterious, easily sort of used rationale and taboo topic to justify gender inequalities, that actually people are aware of what's happening in their body, can improve their experiences, but also resist some of these gender and racial stereotypes. So the findings of my PhD study with these 4 main discursive themes, I'll briefly go out through them, but obviously there's a lot more detail in the book. The first one really was mind over matter. So even before starting my PhD, I had really noticed this, that when you talk to people about ordinary people, patients or just people experiencing menstrual cycles, we tend to talk about all sorts of different changes, typically physical and maybe some emotional, particularly irritability, a little bit of low mood, but also constipation, diarrhea, pain, period pain, but also sort of joint aching, those sorts of things, temperature change. Whereas when you looked at the literature and when I interviewed these experts on PMS, it was very clear immediately that actually, even though we were all speaking about the same word, PMS, the different participant groups were actually describing very different things. So the biomedical, the sort of medical doctors who are experts on PMS, they were mainly talking about very severe emotional distress, so particularly suicidal ideation. And these are the same group of people that helped distinguish the sort of medical diagnoses of PMS from another one called PMDD, premenstrual dysphoric disorder, which is associated with cyclic experiences of severe emotional change, and including suicidal ideation. So it's interesting that the very people that defined what PMS is, what PMDD is, and what a healthy change is, although they don't tend to do that, when I asked them about PMS, they were consistently giving me examples or descriptions of what would be better described either as PMDD or the cyclic exacerbation, the worsening of underlying emotional distress. The critical experts, so these are feminists who've specialized in critiquing these sort of medical descriptions of cyclical symptoms for the past 40 plus years, they tended to also just talk about emotional distress, but they were talking about slightly less severe examples. So more akin to kind of a depressed mood, low self-esteem, maybe becoming worse at certain times in the cycle, but not sort of suicidal things. They weren't as extreme, but they were still just talking about mood. And then the patient group, which was brilliant and really quite diverse, were the most accurate. So when I compared these descriptions with the available data we have on cyclical changes, the patient's descriptions were the most accurate. So they described a whole range of things, physical changes, pain, in fact, predominantly pain, and sort of digestive changes, bleeding and tiredness, all those things, and some mentions of emotional change. So this is very interesting because it should be the scientists whose descriptions most closely match the available information, but they didn't. There was also a lot of, so moving on to the second theme, Snatch 22. So this is what I call, there's a paradox when we're talking about menstrual health, because nobody's taught about healthy menstrual physiology and why we have certain changes and that these are inflammatory, that the immune system is involved. There's a real tendency to position the symptoms of underlying conditions such as endometriosis, adenomyosis, fibroids, the sort of exacerbation of things like depression, that they put them on the far end of a normal curve. And this isn't true. These are health conditions. They might happen on a cyclic basis, but a bit like, so some people have cyclic epileptic seizures, cyclic asthma attacks, migraine, menstrual migraine is very common. They're not at the far end of typical changes. What's happening is that the inflammatory, healthy processes going on in the body can trigger underlying health conditions that somebody might have. A bit like if you're if you're tired, you haven't slept well, or if you haven't eaten for a while, how that can affect your mood and it can make you fatigued. That's kind of what's happening in the body. You have a little immune response going on between ovulation and the menstruation. So this can worsen underlying emotional feelings, but also symptoms of underlying conditions. IBS would be another common one that gets exacerbated. The curse, so this is a sort of common trope, I think, when we think about menstruation, the idea that because we bleed cyclically, and that's obviously a bleeding in general is seen by humans as not a good thing, as something that's scary and frightening. And, you know, particularly if you're not then taught why we bleed, it does remain sort of weird and unsettling and something that doesn't seem right. And this gets tied in with gender norms. So the idea that femininity is itself a kind of illness or is the cause of the female prevalence of certain conditions. This is an old belief. It used to be that everyone thought the womb was causing these things. Now people think it's the sex hormones. So people, in general, all of the participant groups thought it was probably the sex hormones that caused all of the symptoms, when in fact they don't cause any cyclic symptoms. There was quite a lot of exaggeration, like asking people, how many people do you think experience PMS or PMDD? There was a lot of exaggeration. Again, people just don't know And so you sort of think this must happen to all women or most women. Black box is the final main sort of discursive theme coming from the data. And this is what got me to do that review of all of the textbooks, because I couldn't believe particularly from the biomedical experts, what I was hearing. So when I asked them, how would you describe PMS to somebody who hadn't heard of it before? What do you think causes cyclic symptoms? What do you think is happening in the body? They didn't talk about any physiology at all, not even prostaglandins, which are hormones that we know cause those period cramps for sure. And we also know that's what causes period pain. But they weren't talking about that at all. They were talking about the female sex hormones. And that's what prompted me to sort of double check, well, what are these gynecologists, psychiatrists, GPs, highly qualified, very nice people. None of them would want to be sexist. None of them would be knowingly ignorant about menstrual physiology. Why are they not why do they not know as much as I knew at that point about menstrual physiology? And that's where I realized they're not taught it. So nobody's taught it at all. So only really people who work in fertility get a hold of this information. That would be super useful. Right. So a bit like the implications of not being taught menstrual physiology at all, it looks like these kind of gender norms and these myths of the hormonal hysterical female have trumped the available sort of empirical data that we have. There are sort of lots of ramifications for this. You might experience disbelief in your experiences. You're not going to get proper treatment. There are these political things, these myths about the hormonal female, the fact that women aren't believed about all sorts of experiences, how if you get really severe pain or severe heavy bleeding, it gets normalized, and yet somehow all women are seen to be ill or debilitated by the menstrual cycle. There's this catch-22 situation, and there's obviously clinical implications.
Hi, Sally. Just to let you know, it's been 35 minutes.
Okay, this is the last slide, so I've done okay. So really this book is kind of, certainly if you're interested in this topic, the reference list is basically your sort of totally comprehensive list of everything you need to read from both the critical literature and the biomedical literature, particularly on PMS, but on the sort of women's reproductive health and education field in general. And the thing that I'm most sort of proud of is hopefully being able to disrupt this very, very old sort of myth, medical myth, which is the reason why some symptoms and conditions are female prevalent is due to femininity. At first, this was the idea of the womb, the hysterical female, and now I think for several decades it's been the hormonal female. Instead of looking at what are the similarities between male and female bodies, things like inflammation that men also experience, and that also makes them experience pain and changes in mood, for example. So, that's what I'm most proud of, I think. There is a slide here just with some references. So I'll leave this up for a bit, but if we could do some question and answers, that would be good.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. That was fascinating. I've read the book as well, and I have to say I very much enjoyed it and would really recommend everyone to read it. We haven't had any specific questions yet in the chat, so please write them in. But I will share some of the praise that you've received, Sally. So Helen posted a message during the first slide when you're talking about all the different animals that menstruate. I didn't know about the mouse. It's that was quite fun to hear about. So it's all very fascinating. Heather sends her congratulations as well, as does Chella, as does Cami as well. While I wait for everyone else to write their questions in the chat, I guess I'll use my chair's privilege and to ask you, Sally, kind of what your next steps are with all the findings from the book, to kind of continue what you were saying before, basically at the end of the talk.
Yeah, well, a lot of this depends on whether I get funded or not, but as is the case for most researchers in academia at the moment, and particularly with women's health and particularly within menstrual health, it's a tricky environment, but the idea would be to get funding to translate some of this So although I tried to write the book as accessibly as possible, it is still very much an academic book. So it's fully referenced. It's actually quite dense, full of references, and it contains some sort of information about physiology that some readers might find a bit tricky. So I think really a great thing to be able to do is to make this a more sort of public-faced book or resources to help people learn about their bodies from an earlier age, know how to manage healthy menstrual physiological changes, and also to be able to make that decision about what's normal, what isn't, when to seek medical advice. And obviously, associated with that, I have sort of ongoing work trying to persuade medical textbook publishers of textbooks to include more comprehensive menstrual physiology, to include it in general practice training, because I think really GPs are the first line with most menstrual health issues. And again, this isn't actually difficult science or difficult sort of interactions. Any really severe symptoms that happen on a regular basis are usually indicative of some sort of underlying condition. It's not normal to be vomiting in pain, passing out, losing so much blood that you can't go to school, you can't go to work. So it's sort of the least that could happen, to be honest, is for GPs to have a bit more education than they do on menstrual health. But these
Yeah,
things,
definitely.
it's not going to be me alone. This has to come from, everybody raising awareness and asking for these changes.
Yeah, absolutely. We actually do have a related question. So Sarah Marks asks, what impact would your research have on workplace policies around periods, for example, period leave or menopause leave? I know you've written about that.
Yeah, well, first of all, if you have a menstrual health issue like endometriosis, you don't need period leave, you need medical treatment, ideally to suppress your cycle so that you're not having internal bleeding every month for 40 years, causing all sorts of irreparable damage. So there are things that can happen in the workplace. I don't think having a specific leave described as period leave is helpful. I think it pathologizes healthy experiences, but I do think the workplace is a great place to do more awareness raising and menstrual health literacy, because at the moment we have this situation where if you're not being taught it at school and you don't go on to become a doctor, or even if you do become a doctor or a gynecologist, when are you expected to learn about these things? So the workplace actually becomes a really great location where everybody's an adult, or most workplaces. Everybody has kind of calmed down a bit about sex and reproduction. It's a kind of less of a taboo topic, hopefully. And also, it opens, particularly menstrual health, opens up the space to talk about all sorts of things, like mental health, pain, dealing with pain at work, having flexible working for all sorts of, not just health issues, but for instance, with parents of young children, flexibility is very important. So it is a good sort of vehicle or a starting point to discuss how your workplace can support you and your employees. But yeah, I wouldn't go immediately for impulse policies, which I would put menstrual leave under that.
Yeah, absolutely. So we also have some more praise. So Chella says, enormous praise for your unwavering perseverance. The menstrual discourse is much richer for it. Hear, hear. I completely agree. Um, and also congratulations from Jasmine. And we have a question here from Cami. I wondered what your thoughts were on investigating or researching changes throughout the menstrual cycle. For example, cognitive changes, mood changes, productivity, libido, etc.
Yeah, I think it's super interesting how they mirror gender norms, sexist ones usually, stereotypes. And in fact, just trying to think, Mary Putnam in 1879 wrote a dissertation piece having to demonstrate that women aren't less productive at different times of the menstrual cycle. This is in the US. She's one of the first women doctors in the world. And it was a time when industrialization was expanding in the US, and there were questions over whether women should get paid for their work or not, or are they less productive, are they less able workers? I still hear this today, even though, of course, sweatshops demonstrate that young women actually appear to be more productive than young men. There's a reason why it's young women in sweatshops. But, the menstrual cycle, or in fact, the reproductive body, there were, at the same time, there were claims that education would make you infertile, work, paid work would make you infertile. Basically, anything other than your prescribed role as a wife or mother was bad for you, i.e., your fertility, bad for your health. So this goes on, and I see this a lot, particularly in sports science. People are trying to be, working with elite athletes. Of course, you're going to do all you can possibly do to improve somebody's performance, which is great. But there's a lot of misinformation there too. So, for instance, it's known that you're more likely to damage your cruciate knee ligament around ovulation. But I can't tell you how many published scientific articles there are that say that this is to do with estrogen, for which there is no data. It's to do with relaxin, which is a hormone, and it does what it says on the tin, relaxin, particularly in pregnancy and in childbirth. It's the hormone that allows both your tissue, your muscles, but also your hips and other anatomy to enable a massive baby to come out of a small space. And it does change in its levels, and it changes its impact on certain tissues throughout the menstrual cycle. So I suppose it's always useful to have more research on cyclical physiology, but the danger is if you're not aware of some of these gender tropes and racial tropes, you might unintentionally ask questions that are actually reinforcing a stereotypical belief rather than challenging them.
And we have another question from Gemma, also kind of related. So Gemma Williams, hi Gemma, asked, do you have any plans to do a similar study on medical experts' knowledge of menstrual cycle inflammation, who are specialists in inflammatory conditions, such as inflammatory bowel disease, arthritis, and others, or the textbook analysis in these areas?
No, no, I don't think I had to come up with a methodology for my PhD. I've been working on cyclic symptoms for several years already. And for me, there was this question. One of the main things I wanted to do was to try and bring together the research that critical feminists have been doing on cyclical symptoms with the biomedical research. Because to my mind, I know both of those literatures, and they work together. They're not as oppositional and contrary as both sides would sort of believe. And so it's about actually trying to bring this work and these individuals in some cases together to make better progress. It's not worked that way, so I wouldn't necessarily recommend this methodology as being as fruitful as it could have been, because when you have your ideas challenged, particularly if you've been publishing on something for a while, so from both camps, I've received maybe some great support and acknowledgements, and people are really interested in the work. But at the same time, it hasn't brought everyone together because, of course, nobody likes being challenged, and it's difficult to, medical paradigm shifts typically take about 10 years at least to happen. So I wasn't expecting things to change. But I hear your point. I do think, because certainly we need some immunologists and people who know about inflammation to really get on board with women's health, because that is a sex difference. And it's not just a sex difference from birth, it's something that switches at puberty, and in some cases, or in some ways, switches back at menopause. And so, those are the people that have really expert knowledge in even how to begin to ask questions and how to do experiments, for example, to look at. So, for instance, we know that people who experience PMS have higher levels of certain inflammatory markers than those who don't. But it's unclear. We know a few of those inflammatory markers, but not all of them have been tested and looked into. So I do think for any, particularly autoimmune conditions, which are female prevalent, and particularly when we're of reproductive age, of course, it's very fruitful to really check that those working are at least working with somebody from immunology or somebody who understands about physiology, healthy physiology, rather than in the silos. So I think PMS has struggled from being either gynecology or psychiatry, and that creating a bit of some cooperation, but also some challenges in ownership and descriptions. You know, what are we talking about here? What sorts of treatments would we recommend? Which hasn't been helpful. And I'd say that's probably the same for other health conditions.
Fantastic, thank you. We've got quite a few more questions coming in, which is great. So the next one is from Nelwazi. Sorry if I pronounced your name wrong. Massive congratulations, Sal. What was the process of working with the editor like for you? How did you feel afterwards when it was off to press?
I didn't really get an editor. I mean, there was an editor in that it got copy edited. The book got copy edited after I'd written it all. I think academic publishing, it's very no frills, no perks. So you don't get paid to write an academic book. I was lucky and got a couple of fellowships that helped me to write it. But then even the kind of work from that final draft to publication is a long one. It's nearly a year in my case, and there was a lot of additional work, checking proofs, checking them again, getting copyright permissions, doing all this work. So for any academics and researchers and students in the audience, don't underestimate how long it takes to write an academic book and how you're not going to get paid for it at all. So it's hard, but now that we've finally published it, it is a relief, particularly to me, to kind of have something that I hope will help me in sort of future funding proposals and getting my ideas out there. You know, I publish them on my own website, on the Menstrual Matters website. People within menstrual health activism know about my work, but it's a big world, and there's a lot of kind of, particularly at the moment, there's a lot of monetization of things like menopause and some aspects of menstrual health. Certainly fertility has been monetized for decades, and they've got money, so they sort of swamp people's knowledge, particularly on social media, with money-making schemes usually. So yeah, it is tricky. I worked with Policy Press, which comes out of Bristol University, and I chose them because they make their books more affordable. Sometimes academic books cost hundreds of pounds. The paperback version of the book is £20 and sometimes lower, which is more affordable. They're also very progressive. Some of the titles they've done on other health inequality, trans health, trans inclusive, just made me know that they were nice. So yeah, you've got to really think. Don't take on a book deal lightly, is what I'm saying. Not a book deal, but writing a book. It's hard work. But if you want that kind of academic credibility, it can, well, we don't know yet, but I think it will really help.
Fantastic, thank you, Sally. It's almost 3 o'clock, and we have quite a few more questions. Would you like me to continue or just pick one last one?
If you pick one last one, and then
So many good
I've
ones.
recorded the Zoom, so hopefully I'll see all of them, and if I can respond to them in some other way.
Okay, there's so many more amazing comments and congratulations for you to look through after. So I'll ask this one because it's slightly different from what we've spoken about before. Do you think there is a case for embedding patient voice in research and diagnosis of conditions like endometriosis based on your research, considering biomedical experts' inaccuracy at describing PMDD, PMS?
Yeah, I wouldn't say it was an inaccuracy. I think one of the major findings was if you're a medical clinician expert, you're only seeing a certain percentage of people. So if we're talking about menstrual health, the people you are seeing are those whose symptoms are so bad, and usually, so for instance, if you have really bad swollen and sore breasts on a cyclical basis, your GP can probably help you with that. So you're not even going to get referred to a gynecologist in most cases. Even period pain now, hopefully, GPs are a bit better in sorting out between, okay, is this sort of bad but healthy period pain, or is this a sign of endometriosis or adenomyosis? Admittedly, I don't think waiting for a surgery in order to get a diagnosis is good at all. Hopefully we can change that. But we do know this is nothing against clinicians. The point is what you're taught and not taught as a clinician, and then who you're seeing on a daily basis really does impact the kinds of research questions you ask. So let's think with endometriosis. I think there's also a difference. Clinicians don't have as much time. So quite a lot of the patients I've met have been very expert in their condition. And I really mean it. So not just in their lived experience and knowing about what their symptoms are, but they've read around the subject in a way that I think some academics and clinicians don't always have time to, or just aren't used to doing. So most clinicians and researchers read within their discipline. They might occasionally read across if it's on a topic that, you know, is their speciality. Whereas patients will read anything and everything, historical documents, you know, blow everything. And they actually become very good at critical thinking, sort of working out, is this nonsense, is this not? There's a great paper on endometriosis done in France where they interviewed experts and people with endometriosis about their common symptoms. This is one of the things that inspired my methodology. And what struck me about that was none of the patients mentioned depression. They were asked about their endometriosis symptoms, and all of the clinicians did mention it. So it's not as if, you know, I'm pretty sure that the study wasn't long enough to sort of go into what was being talked about. But I'm willing to bet that some of those patients did experience low and anxious mood because they're in pain, because they're unable to work, unable to do sort of daily activities. But to them, there was a clear distinction about being depressed because you've got endometriosis and what is endometriosis. And it was interesting that the clinicians all said depression was a symptom of endometriosis. And this, again, you get into this slight psychologization of something physiological that's going on. You know, endometriosis really is a sort of fibrotic disease. It looks like it's autoimmune. Yeah, this is a long answer, but I think don't write people off, but you do have to acknowledge that people are coming from different viewpoints and they might actually be speaking about slightly different things.
Great. So I guess it's time to wrap up. Do you want to make any kind of final comments, Sally?
Just really thank you all again. It's really great to see some of your faces and lots of names that I recognise. And you know, get in touch. Any further comments or questions, particularly if anyone wants to collaborate on anything. But yeah, thank you all very much.
Thank you so much, everyone. Lots more congratulations coming through.
Thanks.
Oh, Jasmine's asking what the best way is to get in touch with you.
Okay, I'll put my there you go. So if you Google Sally King in King's College London or KCL, people can get in touch.